Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me. So I'm here to talk to you about vegetation in Australia and how we monitor that using remote sensing and GIS. So if you're interested in anything to do with vegetation, biodiversity, or water, how that influences vegetation, you might find this talk relevant and hopefully interesting as well. I'm from the University of Western Australia, and this picture you're seeing is our campus, for those who haven't been here. So by vegetation dynamics, I would like to talk about phenology. The definition of land surface phenology is the study of seasonal dynamics of vegetated land surface from remote sensing imagery. Why we care about phenology? Because it's to do with our daily lives. It might seem like a strange word to you, land surface phenology, but it's to do with our daily lives. When you tweet a beautiful jacaranda bloom season, say jacaranda blooming is earlier this year, you are tweeting phenology, phenological event. The blooming of trees is a phenological event under the definition of land surface phenology. And changes in these events reflect response of ecosystems to climate change. Here, I'm showing what it's like looking at phenology from remote sensing. This red profile along a year on the x-axis from Jan to December is what we get from satellite data. So from raw satellite data, we calculate indices. For example, this is one of the indices we could calculate. And that the index will go up and down across time. And from that profile, we can design algorithms to detect when things happen to plants. For example, when they bloom, when they reach the peak of their growing season, when they finish their growing season. So I'd like to show you how and where I'm talking to a data science center. So I'd like to show you it's a lot to do with data. So we collect data on the ground to ground truth our models, and we collect data using drones or even airplanes, and also through other science infrastructure like elecovariance towers, with instruments mounted on those towers, for example, cameras, to look at vegetation from different levels. And then across the globe, we have satellites monitoring the entire planet. Combining all levels of data, we see different level of information and we combine them, then design algorithms and models to get vegetation information. For those who are not familiar with remote sensing, you might wonder, what do you see from remote sensing and how can you see vegetation? This is one major thing we see from remote sensing. Our land surface reflects sunlight and the satellite sensors, onboard satellites, capture that reflectance. And the reflectance would then look like this figure. We have different wavelength bands, and during each wavelength bands, we have different reflectance. And vegetation reflectance is unique. From special bands that we can differentiate vegetation from other land surface like buildings, lakes, or even differentiate healthy and unhealthy vegetation, we design vegetation indices that can capture those information. And besides vegetation indices, to track vegetation growth and phenology, we also have other people in the field have designed and are designing geospatial models that mimic what happens in nature, and then estimate those phenological events. Also, the machine learning approach can be applied in all aspects in this field of study. Instead of designing special geospatial models like land surface models or vegetation growth models that require prior knowledge to your field, you can also feed machine learning models with data and let your data tell you what is happening. So for this research, I actually look at global vegetation growth, but I would like to talk to you about Australian vegetation growth today, because this is the biggest research gap, one of the biggest. I might be biased because I'm here, but I'll show you also why it's not just my personal preference, it's also a big research gap in the field that we all need to address. But I feel like if we don't address it in Australia, nobody will, because currently, if we look at the left panel, the small one here, there is a global data set that NASA funded to design and inform global vegetation phenology, land surface phenology. But this is what we get in Australia. In a very wet year when vegetation grew very well in Australia in 2016, this is showing when peak of the growing season occurred, what date, from day 1 to day 365 in different colors, when that happened across Australia. White in the interior area means no data. So if you want to know vegetation phenology or relevant information about vegetation in Australia, Australia is very data or information poor in that regard. We are looking at roughly 70% of the continent missing out information. So collaborating with data scientists, remote sensors like myself, and plant experts, plant physiologists, ecologists, we aimed to address this gap. And just to before I show you how, just to show you what's missed out in the interior Australia, the climate there is dry. Climate zone-wise, we're looking at arid and semi-arid areas. And land cover map tells us we have shrublands, savannas, grasslands in those areas. We have heaps going on. So we need to know vegetation, phenology information there. Just again, a step back to show you why vegetation growth is unknown in Australia, in interior Australia, and why it remains a challenge. There are two hypotheses. One is that the Australian climate is very different, and two is that our vegetation is to do with the first one. Because of the climate and the Australian land conditions, our vegetation growth is unique. So this map is showing you the climate. The three colors, blue, green, and red, show you the three elements or climate factors that limit vegetation growth. And I would like to draw your attention to Northern Hemisphere and Australia, because most of current research is done by people based in Northern Hemisphere. And their priority, those areas, their priority to focus on Northern Hemisphere means that their algorithms designed for those areas does not work well in Australia, because vegetation growth is limited either by radiation or temperature, or together by these two in Northern Hemisphere, but primarily limited by water in Australia. That's common sense. We all know that here. And this paper, amongst many other great papers that reported how important Australian growth, vegetation growth is to global study. For example, in 2010 to 2011, when Australia had a La Nina event and had heaps of rainfall, extra rainfall compared to average year, and we had vegetation growing across the continent. In that year, 60% of the global carbon uptake anomaly was attributed to Australia. So let me recap that. When Australia had a La Nina event and vegetation grew across the continent, especially in the dry interior area, that much extra growth caused 60% of the global carbon uptake anomaly. So without getting Australia right, there's no way getting the global carbon uptake right or global carbon cycling right. So that's the climate. And we also hypothesized that vegetation is different here. That's one of the other reasons why the global algorithm did not work in Australia. So we improved instead of reinventing the wheels, we improved based on the global algorithm and modified it based on our hypothesis and then ground truth data to reason that. So the upper panel, I'm showing satellite-derived vegetation index in blue or navy color across time. Across many years, the ups and downs show us vegetation activity. And this is a site in Alice Spring, looking at Mulga. At that site, they measure carbon and water flux to estimate vegetation activity and calculate a thing called GPP, gross primary productivity, in gray color here. So the gray profile is our ground measured vegetation growth, and the navy one is from satellite data. They both show us first thing, there are ups and downs. So there are things growing. And the bottom panel is the monthly rainfall at that site. So we know in a place like Alice Spring, 500 kilometers to Uluru, vegetation growth is triggered by rainfall events. And we see these rainfall events before each bump in our profiles of vegetation activity. So that tells us that things are growing, but why the global algorithm missed out those is that the red shaded area, that is a magnitude of 0.1 in terms of vegetation growth, the vegetation index, is required by the existing algorithm. The global algorithm required that the ups and downs or the amplitude of each growth cycle needs to jump out of the red shaded area to be greater than or equal to 0.1 for that algorithm to think this is a real growing season as opposed to noise in our data. But obviously now we see that doesn't make much sense in Australia, like in Alice Spring. So we modify that threshold and replace that with an average value of multi-year vegetation growth. So that will be the red line here. So we got rid of the shaded area and just used the red line. Now all the seasons jump above the red line will be considered as a real growing season. And in terms of phenology, I mentioned phenological events. So these are the metrics to do with those events that we extract from time series of satellite-derived vegetation index. We extract the start of growing season, the peak of growing season, end of growing season. These are all timing indices, time in a year, and the length of each growing season. And we also extract the value, the magnitude, the value at each point when things happen. and we ground truth the results with flux data that I introduced before. This is the remote sensing drill of how we generate data from satellite data. So using satellite raw data or remote sensors called satellite products of vegetation index, we do quality control and further process the data, feed them into our algorithm, and then generate information or maps that people can use that tell you when things happen to vegetation in Australia across 16 years. These are annual maps. So here we are looking at some examples about our maps versus the previously introduced global maps. Again, in that year, when I told you about the research gap, the same year, same metric. On the left, we're looking at what global product offered us in 2 seasons in 2016. And now the middle panel and the right panel are providing us this much information for the same metric, the time when vegetation reached the peak of the growing season in that year. The reason for 2 seasons, because things like crops and grasses might grow in 2 seasons, might appear for more than 1 season. So visually, we see a big improvement for our algorithm. Now we are looking at color-coded pixels in interior Australia. We have information. And there's a lot we could do with such information. For example, the shrublands that was almost completely missed out in previous global product. Now we have vegetation phenology. If you looked at shrublands and look at the productivity estimated by vegetation index. So on the X, we have vegetation index estimated productivity. So on the X-axis, we have productivity. On the Y-axis, we have number of pixels. So this is like a population of productivity of all shrubland pixels. So the histogram is showing us in blue color what it's like in a wet year, and in red color what it's like in a dry year. If you tally the numbers, the productivity of shrublands in Australia can be nearly twice as much as that in a dry year. This kind of variability will cause uncertainties in environmental management, agriculture management, global carbon modeling. So this information still needs improvement, still needs further development, ground truthing, etc. But it's a start for us to look at these things. And there are other things we could do with such phenological information. Here's a study that I did about grasslands using phenology information to answer a question. Is climate change changing the distribution of warm and cool season grasses? First, why? Grasses cover 40% of the world. They are vital to food security and terrestrial ecosystem water, carbon, and nutrition cycling. There are 2 types of grasses in terms of their functional photosynthetical traits. Cool season or C3 grasses tend to grow in cool and wet climate, and warm season, also called C4 grasses, tend to grow in hot climate. The right panel is showing us where these 2 types of grasses exist or appear in Australia. According to a citizen science database, those are what people recorded, the occurrence of species. In reality, we don't have nearly as much information as we see because these dots are manipulated. You're looking at a huge dot, which in reality is a tiny, tiny location. But from here, we see in the south, where it's cool, it's mostly C3 grasses. In the north, where it's warm, it's mostly C4 grasses. So there is a transition. But to answer the question, is climate change changing the distribution of warm and cool season grasses? We need more data. First, we need wall-to-wall grass species distribution instead of this sparse information from citizen science. And we need such information across many years to analyze where the distribution of grasses has changed, and if so, what caused such change. So on the left, we are looking at rainfed pasture distribution in Australia. And in this study, we looked at Eastern Australia to start with. Again, why do we care about grass distribution or composition change? Because it's to do with grazing, fire, and carbon cycles. So these two lines are telling us the seasonality of these two types of grasses. The red line is showing the seasonal pattern on the y-axis, seasonal growth pattern of warm season, also called C4 grasses. It reaches the peak right after summer and before autumn. And the other line, the navy line, is showing us the seasonality of a typical cool season or C3 grass. It reaches the peak in spring. So the seasonality of these two types of grasses are very different. Imagine if one type is replaced by the other in the same geographical location, like in Sydney. In Sydney, imagine in the Blue Mountains, where there used to be grasses of the blue type that peak in spring, and you don't have much of those in summer. And now, due to climate change or some other factors, the blue guys are gone, replaced by these red guys. That spells fire fuel, because now in summer, you have lots of grasses growing, and towards the end of their growing season, they're ready to burn. So that's one of the reasons why we look at this. How we look at that from remote sensing, again, this familiar profile that I show you again and again a long time. And on y-axis is vegetation index. We calculate that for each pixel. And in this study, the pixel resolution is 500-meter resolution. The idea is that if a pixel looks like the red profile that reaches the peak in summer, we classify that as a warm season grass pixel. And likewise, if a pixel profile looks like the navy one that reaches the peak in around October in spring, we classify that as a cool season or C3 grass pixel. And because you can't see information down to one plant from remote sensing, within that 500 by 500 meter pixel, you might have codominance of two types. Then that would look like the gray profile. You see two peaks, one in each season. And this is a slide that I've never showed before in a science talk, but I'd like to show it to the data science people or people interested in data science. It's the beauty of data science. When you think about this, it's easy, but in practice, when you cut the window for warm season grasses and cool season grasses, where do you cut the window? At what time do you consider that is a peak within this wide range? I let the data tell me. I think when you have enough of those, they will form something like these, Gaussian distribution. So on the x-axis, The idea is that the peak of growing season, the metric, which is a date in a year, will occur for grasses, and the population should form patterns. The warm season grasses should form a pattern or a bell like the left one, and the cool season grasses should form a bell like the right one. And when there are enough of them to form these distribution, I could then use the Gaussian distribution variables to define the windows. So I know my algorithm can capture like 97% of the grasses within that window. So this is the theory. And this is the beauty of reality. So this is what we got in reality from satellite images. They formed two beautiful Gaussian distribution bells. And from here, we got the time window for us to use then to classify vegetation, C3, C4 grass based on their peak of growing season. And this is what we got. Now we have the maps, the data from 2003 to 2017. Visually, we see there are changes from year to year, drastic changes. The blue colors indicates C3 grass, mostly in the south. Red indicates C4 grass in the north, mostly. And purple is where they coexisted. We see that New South Wales sits in the transition zone between hot Queensland and cool Victoria. And that's where most of the changes occur from year to year. In one year, it could be blue. In the next year, it could be red. So the first finding is that visually, we seem to find a trend of C4 grasses expanding to the south. So the warm season grasses seem to be expanding to the south, where it's cool. It's not a cool thing, though. That might spell trouble. And we ground truthed those maps generated using satellite data, using citizen science observation records to show how accurate our maps are before we go on and analyze the maps. I'm just going to briefly mention the accuracy. We validated separately for C3, C4 individually and for where they coexisted or co-dominated. The accuracy was around and above averagely 80%, which is very high for a remote sensing study. So the whole point of this slide is to tell you the maps are reliable ground truth by this much ground observation records. And now we can go on and analyze the maps. And to answer that question, is climate change changing the distribution of C3 and C4 grasses? So from our maps, we tallied the proportion of C3, C4 grasses in each year. And just across 15 years, we saw a significant increase in C4 grasses, which was again validated by ground observations with the same and also stronger trend of that C4 grass increase. And the next finding is that we were able to answer that question. Is climate change changing grass distribution? We plotted the C3, C4 grass proportion along latitude, just to show a geographical concept of where they are, and along temperature, mean annual temperature, and along rainfall pattern. I'll unpack the rainfall pattern in a second. So I'll start with by latitude. It's intuitive. Further go to the south, you see more C4 grasses. Further go to the north, to Queensland, you see more C4 grasses, the hot guys, warm season grasses. Temperature says the same thing, higher mean annual temperature the more C4 grasses you see, which is the main finding up until our study. Studies have always been reporting that it is temperature that drives distribution of C3, C4 grasses. But in our study in Australia, we found a stronger correlation between rainfall pattern and C3, C4 grass distribution. So here the rainfall pattern is a complex formula that simply tells you whether in a year rainfall concentrated in winter or in summer. So further you go from the x-axis to the left to the negative values, that's when in a year the annual rainfall concentrated more in winter. And the opposite direction, that's when the annual rainfall concentrated more in summer. So it's not the absolute amount of annual rainfall, it's how much of that fell in summer or how much of that fell in winter. So the more of that fell in winter, the more full season grass, C3 grass you will see. And these are the spatial details of the same conclusion. So when I show you these came from here. For each pixel, we'd have that, and we tally them and calculate that profile. That's an average of all pixels. But now let's look at the spatial details. On the left, we have two maps of grass distribution. On the right, we have rainfall patterns. The negative values, orange, red colors indicate that the annual rainfall concentrated more in summer. And the green, blue colors indicate that the annual rainfall concentrated in, let's start again. So the blue color and green color on these rainfall pattern maps indicate that the annual rainfall concentrated more in summer. And the other two colors indicate the annual rainfall concentrated more in winter. So when the rain falls mostly in summer in 2014, you see more red pixels here in New South Wales that indicates C4 grass occurrence, the warm season grasses. So more summer rainfall associated with more warm season grasses. And then just in a year, the next year, rainfall pattern shifted along with the grass distribution. So to conclude, Australia lacks vegetation dynamics information, and we improved the spatial coverage of land surface phenology information in Australia from below a quarter of the continent to above 70% of the continent. And we used that information to study climate change impact on grass distribution. We found that satellite-derived phenology was able to classify and map distribution of C3, C4 grasses. And those maps allowed us to find that grass distribution changes associated with climate change that will assist in planning adaptation strategies regarding fire, grazing, wildlife, and invasive species, and more accurate modeling of global water, carbon, and energy exchanges. And you can use such information for many other applications as well, including quantifying ecosystem resilience to climate change, bushfire fuel accumulation, native vegetation condition assessment, etc. I'll stop here. Thank you.